A billionaire CEO breaks down in tears when he sees his ex-wife in the newspaper, exactly 1 year after their divorce. Jonathan Hale strode through the glass corridors of his corporate headquarters, the sleek, modern architecture reflecting the sharp edges of his tailored suit. The air hummed with the energy of a well-oiled machine. Assistants moved briskly, phones buzzed, and the low murmur of important conversations filled the space. Jonathan's presence commanded attention, his every step purposeful as he prepared for the most pivotal press conference of his career. Today was the day he would unveil the latest initiative for Hale Innovations, a groundbreaking venture poised to reshape the tech industry and cement his legacy as a visionary leader. But beneath the polished surface, cracks were forming. The night before, Jonathan hadn't slept. Insomnia had become a constant companion in recent months, its presence gnawing at the edges of his carefully curated existence. He blamed the stress. There was always a new deal to close, a competitor to outmaneuver, but the truth was far more complicated. Success had come at a cost, though he rarely allowed himself the luxury of introspection to pinpoint exactly what he'd lost. Now, standing in his corner office, he adjusted his cufflinks and surveyed the city skyline. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, a man who had everything, yet felt nothing. He shook the thought away. There was no time for self-pity. Today was about triumph, about ensuring the world saw him as the unstoppable force he had worked so tirelessly to become. "Mr. Hale," his assistant Claire called from the doorway. "The press kit has been finalized, and the conference begins in 2 hours. Would you like to review it?" Jonathan nodded curtly, not bothering to turn. "Leave it on my desk. I'll go through it shortly." Claire hesitated. "Also, the morning papers are here." "Just the business section," he said, waving her off. A moment later, the sound of papers rustling broke the silence as Claire set them on the desk and left. Jonathan poured himself a coffee, his movements mechanical. He approached the desk and flipped open the paper, skimming the headlines with detached interest until one caught his eye, stopping him cold. "A Heart for the Forgotten, Margot Hale's Mission to Change Lives." His breath hitched as he stared at the bold black letters. Below the headline was a photograph, a candid shot of Margot standing outside a rundown shelter, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, her expression warm and open. She was surrounded by children, their smiles wide as they clung to her hands. The article detailed her efforts to rebuild a women's and children's shelter that had fallen into disrepair, a cause she had championed for years. Jonathan's chest tightened. He hadn't seen her face in months, not since the divorce. He had convinced himself he didn't need to, that burying himself in work was the only way to move forward. But now, here she was, radiant and alive in a way he couldn't remember seeing for years. He sank into his chair, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The words blurred as his mind raced back to the last time they had spoken. It had been in this very office, their voices rising in an argument that felt both distant and painfully fresh. Margot had begged him to reconsider his priorities, to find balance, to make room for something other than work. He had dismissed her concerns as melodrama, certain that she would come around as she always had. But she hadn't. The memory cut deep, sharper than he was prepared for. He tried to push it aside, to focus on the article in front of him. Yet the more he read, the heavier the weight in his chest became. Margot's passion for the shelter was palpable in every line, her commitment to helping others shining through the text. It was a stark contrast to the man he had become, a man who measured his worth in quarterly profits and market shares. Jonathan set the paper down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling as an unfamiliar ache spread through him. It wasn't just regret, it was something deeper, something raw and unspoken. He thought of the woman Margot used to be when they first met, how her laughter had filled their tiny apartment, how she had once believed in him more than he believed in himself. She had been his anchor, his conscience, his heart. And now, she was a stranger. The intercom buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. "Mr. Hale, your 10 o'clock call is ready," Claire's voice announced. "Cancel it," he said hoarsely, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir?" I said cancel it. he repeated, sharper this time. No interruptions. He stood abruptly and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands clenched at his sides. The city stretched out before him, a testament to his achievements, yet it felt hollow now. The photo of Margot lingered in his mind, taunting him. Her smile, so genuine, so unburdened, was a mirror reflecting everything he had lost. Unable to contain the storm of emotions building inside him, Jonathan paced the room before finally collapsing into the chair by the window. His breaths came shallow and uneven as he tried to fight back the tears threatening to spill over. But it was no use. The dam broke, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. It wasn't just about Margot. It was about the man he had become, the choices he had made, the sacrifices he had justified. He had traded love for ambition, intimacy for power, and now, staring at the city that bore his name, he felt like a ghost haunting his own life. Jonathan buried his face in his hands, his mind spiraling with memories of Margot's laughter, her warmth, her unwavering belief in him. He thought of the shelter, of the lives she was touching, of the purpose she had found without him. And for the first time, he wondered if it was too late to find his own. The intercom buzzed again, but Jonathan didn't move. He sat there, lost in a whirlwind of regret and longing, as the city carried on without him. Somewhere out there, Margot was rebuilding lives, creating something beautiful out of brokenness. And Jonathan Hale, the man who had built an empire, felt utterly, devastatingly small. Jonathan sat frozen in his chair, the last few tears drying on his face. The newspaper still lay on his desk, the image of Margot burning in his mind. He told himself he'd had no choice. He told himself he had made the decisions any ambitious man would make. Success required sacrifice, that was the unspoken rule. But even as he tried to convince himself, the weight in his chest grew heavier. It wasn't the loss of Margot's love that hurt the most. It was the realization that he had let go of the one person who truly saw him for who he was, not who the world thought he should be. The memories came unbidden, sharp and unrelenting, like shards of glass piercing through the fragile barrier he had built around his past. He could still see her, as she had been in those early days, long before Hale Innovations was a household name. They had met in a crowded art gallery downtown, where she was volunteering as an organizer. She had been so full of energy, a whirlwind of passion and ideals, her auburn hair tumbling over her shoulders as she explained the importance of preserving art for underserved communities. Jonathan, fresh out of business school and eager to prove himself, had been captivated. She had seen through his polished exterior almost immediately. While others fawned over his ambition and charm, Margot had challenged him, teasing him about his obsession with profit margins and projections. "The world needs more than spreadsheets and stock prices," she had said, her eyes twinkling. He had laughed then, more out of discomfort than amusement, but her words had stayed with him. Those early years had been their golden age. They'd lived in a tiny apartment with peeling paint and a heater that barely worked, scraping by on Margot's modest salary while Jonathan chased his dreams. She had believed in him so fiercely that even when he doubted himself, her faith was enough to push him forward. But success had come faster than either of them had anticipated. His first big deal had led to another, and then another, until Jonathan was swept up in a whirlwind of boardrooms, contracts, and late-night strategy sessions. Margot had been his anchor, always there to ground him when the pressure felt too much. Yet, as his career soared, the demands on his time became unrelenting, and she had slowly faded into the background of his life. He remembered the first time she had voiced her frustration. It had been after he missed her charity gala, a cause she had poured her heart into for months. Jonathan had promised he would be there, but a last-minute investor meeting had kept him away. When he came home late that night, she had been sitting on the couch, still in her gown, her eyes red-rimmed. "Do you even care anymore?" she had asked, her voice trembling. "Or am I just something you check off a list when it's convenient?" He had dismissed her concerns, brushing them off as an overreaction. "This is temporary," he had said, pulling off his tie. "Once I get through this quarter, things will settle down." But they never did. The fights had started soon after. Margot accused him of prioritizing his career over their marriage, while Jonathan accused her of not understanding the pressure he was under. Every argument ended the same way, her begging him to slow down, to take a break, to remember the man he used to be, and him promising that he would, just not yet. The memory of their final fight was the hardest to bear. It had been a rainy Sunday afternoon, and Margot had spent the day preparing a rare homemade dinner, something she said they hadn't done in months. Jonathan had barely touched his plate, his attention fixed on his phone as he fielded emails from a key investor. When Margot finally snapped, her voice trembling with suppressed anger, Jonathan had fired back with words he wished he could take back. "You think I do this for me?" he had said, his tone sharp. "I'm doing this for us, Margot. For the future we talked about. Or have you forgotten that?" Her response had been quiet, devastating. "The future doesn't matter if you've already lost yourself, Jonathan. I don't recognize you anymore." That had been the night she gave him an ultimatum. "Take a step back, just for a while. Be with me. Prove that we still matter to you." But he couldn't. He wouldn't. The idea of stepping back, of losing momentum, was unthinkable. He had built his empire brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, and walking away, even temporarily, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd worked for. The divorce had been civil, almost clinical. No screaming matches, no drawn-out battles over assets. Just a quiet agreement to part ways, both of them too exhausted to fight anymore. He told himself it was for the best, that they wanted different things. And for a while, he had believed it. Back in the present, Jonathan pushed himself out of the chair and paced the length of his office. The hollow ache in his chest had grown unbearable, but he refused to dwell on it. He couldn't afford to. He was Jonathan Hale, the man who always moved forward, no matter the cost. He poured himself a glass of scotch, hoping it would dull the edges of his guilt. As he sipped, he stared at the skyline, the city sprawling beneath him like a monument to his achievements. But the satisfaction he once felt was gone, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. He turned back to the newspaper, his eyes drawn once more to the image of Margot. There she was, radiant and alive, her passion lighting up the page. She had found something he hadn't, something real, something meaningful. And as much as he tried to tell himself that he had made the right choice, that his empire was worth the sacrifices, the doubt gnawed at him like a persistent shadow. For years he had believed that his success would justify everything. The long hours, the missed anniversaries, the arguments, all of it would be worth it in the end. But now, standing alone in his office, he wondered if he had been lying to himself all along. Jonathan took another sip of scotch, his jaw tightening as he forced the memories back into the recesses of his mind. He had made his choices, and there was no undoing them. But as he stared at Margot's picture, a thought he couldn't ignore crept in. What if it wasn't too late? What if, somehow, he could find his way back to the man she once believed in? For the first time in years, Jonathan felt the faint stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. It was fragile and terrifying, but it was there. And it wouldn't let him go. Jonathan stayed late at the office, unable to shake the image of Margot from his mind. The newspaper sat untouched on the corner of his desk, but its presence was like a weight in the room. He tried to focus on the tasks in front of him, emails to respond to, contracts to review, but the words blurred together, meaningless. Every time he blinked, her face returned, her eyes filled with a mixture of warmth and resolve that now felt like an accusation. The scotch hadn't helped, nor had the silence of the empty office. For the first time in years, he couldn't compartmentalize his thoughts, couldn't shut out the persistent ache of regret. The memories he'd unearthed that morning refused to fade, and no amount of distraction seemed capable of burying them again. Just as he reached for his phone, considering calling it a night, he noticed an envelope on his desk. It hadn't been there earlier. He frowned, picking it up. The paper was thick, expensive, and unmarked save for his name written in elegant cursive on the front. There was no return address, no stamp. He turned it over, inspecting the seal, a simple press of wax, unadorned. Strange. Jonathan glanced toward the door, his pulse quickening. No one had entered his office since Claire left hours ago. He flicked on his desk lamp, casting a warm glow over the envelope, and broke the seal with careful precision. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting was fluid, familiar somehow, though he couldn't place it. "If you ever loved her, you need to know the truth." Jonathan's grip tightened on the page as he scanned the rest of the note, his breath catching with every line. "She gave up more for you than you'll ever understand. Something she never wanted you to know because she thought it would hurt you. But you deserve to know what you cost her, and what she still carries because of it. Go to the place where it began. You'll find your answers there. But don't wait too long." There was no signature, no clue as to who had written it. His name wasn't mentioned either, nor Margot's, but the meaning was unmistakable. A rush of unease coursed through him, mingling with the lingering guilt that had plagued him all day. What did the writer mean by "what she still carries" and "the place where it began"? His mind immediately turned to the gallery where they'd first met, but how could that hold the answers to a secret? He read the letter again, trying to detect any hint of its origin. The phrasing felt deliberate, intentional, as though the writer knew him well enough to anticipate his reaction. And why deliver it to his office, where only a handful of people had access? The questions piled on top of one another, each more maddening than the last. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as he turned the letter over in his hands. Who would send this? A friend of Margot's? One of her colleagues? And why now, of all times? He hadn't spoken to her in months. Their lives had become completely separate, hadn't they? For years, Jonathan had convinced himself that their divorce had been inevitable, the natural consequence of two people growing apart. He had allowed himself to believe that Margot had moved on as easily as he had, or at least as easily as he pretended to. But the note suggested something deeper, something he hadn't considered. Margot had always been a private person, unwilling to burden others with her struggles. What had she kept hidden from him? The Scotch glass trembled slightly in his hand as he drained the last of it, setting it down with a thud. His gut told him this wasn't some cruel prank or coincidence. Whoever had written the letter knew something he didn't, and if it involved Margot, he couldn't ignore it. The place where it began. He whispered the phrase aloud, testing it. His thoughts drifted back to the gallery, a flood of nostalgia and longing washing over him. He hadn't stepped foot in that building since their early days together. It had been her world, not his. She had taken him there on their first date, pointing out pieces she loved, telling him stories about the artists. He had felt out of place, unsure of himself, but Margot had made it feel like home. Jonathan stood abruptly, the letters still clutched in his hand. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, his steps brisk and determined. He couldn't sit here stewing in his own thoughts any longer. If there were answers to be found, he needed to start looking. The streets were quiet as he drove across the city, the hum of the engine the only sound in the stillness. The gallery wasn't far, but the distance felt endless. His mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. What had Margot sacrificed? Had she suffered because of him in ways he couldn't imagine? And why hadn't she told him? When he arrived, the sight of the building hit him like a punch to the gut. It was smaller than he remembered, its exterior weathered but charming, illuminated by a single street lamp. Memories surged to the surface, Margot's laughter echoing through the halls, her excitement as she introduced him to her colleagues. This place had been a sanctuary for her, a space where she could dream and create. Jonathan hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. The gallery was dark, its windows shuttered, but as he approached the door, he noticed a faint light glowing from inside. His pulse quickened. The door wasn't locked. He pushed it open cautiously, the creak of the hinges cutting through the silence. The interior was as he remembered it, rows of art pieces lining the walls, the faint scent of varnish and aged wood lingering in the air. But something was different. On a small table near the center of the room sat another envelope, identical to the one he had received earlier. His breath caught as he approached it, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The envelope bore no markings, but he knew it was meant for him. He tore it open, his hands trembling slightly, and unfolded the note inside. "This is where she chose you over herself." The words sent a chill down his spine. What did that mean? His mind flashed to Margot's stories about the gallery, about how she had dreamed of expanding it, turning it into a hub for young artists. Had she given that up for him? But that couldn't be all. The note implied something far more significant, far more painful. He looked around the gallery, searching for clues, for anything that might explain the message. The silence pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating, as his heart pounded in his chest. Who had brought him here, and why? For the first time in years, Jonathan felt completely untethered, unsure of where the truth would lead him. But one thing was certain, he couldn't stop now. Whatever Margot had hidden, whatever secret she had carried all these years, he was determined to uncover it. Even if it shattered him. Jonathan couldn't shake the weight of the note, or the eerie quiet of the gallery, as he drove back to his penthouse that night. His mind churned with questions, but no answers came. The idea that Margot had given something up for him, something she had chosen to keep hidden, was a wound he couldn't stop probing. It felt as though he had torn open the fabric of his carefully constructed life, revealing an undercurrent of selfishness and neglect he had spent years ignoring. The cryptic notes weren't enough. He needed answers. Answers Margot wouldn't willingly give if he asked directly. She had always been fiercely independent, unwilling to let him see her vulnerability. If there was a truth she had buried, he needed to find it another way. The next morning, he called in a favor from an old friend, someone who owed him from a deal years ago. Within an hour, Jonathan had the number of a private investigator who specialized in discretion. The investigator, a wiry man named Callum Ward, showed up at Jonathan's office that afternoon. He had a no-nonsense air about him, the kind of person who got results without asking too many questions. "I need you to dig into someone," Jonathan said, sliding a folder with Margot's details across the desk. "Her life since our divorce. I need to know everything, where she's been, what she's done, and if she's struggling." Callum raised an eyebrow. "Ex-wife? That's a slippery slope." Jonathan's tone was sharp. "It's not about me. She's involved in something that might put her at risk. I need to know what's going on. Money isn't an issue." Callum didn't push further. "I'll need a week." 3 days, Jonathan countered. "I'll triple your fee." Callum nodded, pocketing the folder. "I'll be in touch." The next 3 days crawled by, each hour stretching longer than the last. Jonathan couldn't focus. He went through the motions of his work, attended meetings, and signed contracts, but his mind was elsewhere. Each time his phone buzzed, he snatched it up, hoping for an update from Callum. Finally, on the 3rd day, the call came. "I've got something," Callum said, his voice brisk. "It's bigger than I expected. You're going to want to see this in person." They met that evening in a dimly lit bar near the investigator's office. Callum slid a thick folder across the table and tapped it with his finger. "Your ex-wife's been busy. She's working on a big project, a shelter for women and kids. It's struggling, though. Developers are circling the property, trying to shut it down. Looks like she's poured every penny into keeping it afloat." Jonathan frowned, his chest tightening. "Every penny?" Callum hesitated. "Here's the kicker. About 6 months before you hit it big, she sold her family's vineyard. A place she apparently cared about a lot. Quietly. No public listing, no fanfare. The money went into your company." Jonathan felt as though the air had been knocked out of him. "What?" Callum nodded, his expression serious. "She bailed you out. You were drowning, and she threw you a lifeline. Never told you, did she?" Jonathan stared at the folder, the weight of Callum's words crashing down on him. He remembered those days vividly, the sleepless nights, the mounting pressure as Hale Innovations teetered on the edge of collapse. He had assumed the last-minute funding had come from a risky investor he'd charmed into believing in his vision. But now, the truth loomed over him like a storm cloud. Margot had saved him. She had given up something precious to her to keep his dream alive. And he had been too blind to see it. "Why didn't she tell me?" Jonathan muttered, more to himself than to Callum. "She probably didn't want the gratitude," Callum said, shrugging. "Or the guilt." Jonathan clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Not at Margot, but at himself. He had spent years building an empire, priding himself on his self-made success, while the foundation of it all rested on a sacrifice he had never acknowledged. "What's happening with the shelter?" he asked, his voice tight. Callum leaned back, studying him. "She's in trouble. Developers are pressuring her to sell. It's prime real estate, and she's behind on the mortgage. If she loses it, the people relying on her are out on the street." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He had spent so much time convincing himself that Margot had moved on, that her life had continued without him, but now he realized how wrong he had been. She had taken on the world alone, carrying burdens that should have been theirs to bear together. And he had done nothing. "How much does she need?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A lot," Callum said, tapping the folder again. "Even with donations, it's not enough. The developers are playing dirty, tying her up in legal fees and inspections. They're trying to bleed her dry." Jonathan stood abruptly, shoving the folder under his arm. "Send me the details of the property, everything you have on the developers, and any outstanding debts. I'll take care of it." Callum gave a low whistle. "You're serious about this?" "Damn right I am," Jonathan said, his tone steely. "This ends now." He left the bar with a new sense of purpose, the shame and guilt burning hotter with each step. Margot had sacrificed for him without hesitation, and he had repaid her with neglect. But this time, he wouldn't let her carry the weight alone. If it took his entire fortune to make things right, so be it. When he got back to his office, he spread Callum's findings across his desk, poring over every detail. The shelter's finances were worse than he had imagined. Margot had been holding it together with sheer willpower, fighting against forces far more powerful than she could manage on her own. Jonathan's mind raced with possibilities. He could wipe out the debt with a single check, but that wasn't enough. Margot didn't need a savior, she needed an ally. And if she was going to trust him again, he needed to prove he was in this for more than just a fleeting moment of redemption. By the time dawn broke, Jonathan had a plan. It was ambitious, risky even, but it was the least he could do. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness, a flicker of determination, of hope. Margot had given him everything. Now, it was his turn to do the same. Jonathan moved quickly, sparing no expense. He wasn't ready to face Margot, not yet, but he also couldn't stand idly by while the shelter teetered on the edge of ruin. With Callum's detailed report in hand, he identified the shelter's most pressing financial issues. The mortgage was overdue, the building required repairs to meet code, and legal fees were mounting as the developers tightened their grip. Jonathan funneled a sizable anonymous donation into the shelter's account, enough to clear the mortgage and buy some breathing room. But even as he transferred the funds, he knew it wasn't over. Margot's fight wasn't just about money, it was about standing up to those who saw her efforts as an obstacle to their profits. The developers wouldn't back down just because the immediate debt was gone. The next day, he received confirmation that the donation had gone through. His assistant, Claire, looked puzzled when she handed him a report on Hale Innovations' philanthropy wing, which he had used as cover for the transfer. "Generous move," she said, glancing at the paperwork. "This is outside the usual scope of our projects. Should I expect a public announcement?" "No," Jonathan said firmly. "This stays under the radar." Claire hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." For a brief moment, Jonathan allowed himself to feel relief. He imagined Margot seeing the influx of funds, the reprieve it would bring her, and hoped it would ease some of the weight she carried. But that relief was short-lived. The developers struck back within days. Margot refused to sell, emboldened by the anonymous donation, and they responded with ruthless efficiency. Jonathan's investigator flagged a series of moves they'd made to undermine her: bogus health inspections, fabricated complaints, and threats to local businesses that supported her shelter. It was a coordinated assault designed to choke her efforts into submission. Jonathan paced his office, frustration boiling over. Money alone wasn't enough to protect her. Margot was too stubborn to back down, but she was fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. He couldn't remain in the shadows anymore. If he wanted to help her, he needed to be there, not as the man who left her, but as the man who was ready to stand by her side. That evening, Jonathan sat in his car outside the shelter, staring at the modest brick building as rain pattered against the windshield. The sign above the door was faded, and the windows glowed faintly in the dim light of a cloudy dusk. Volunteers bustled in and out, carrying boxes of supplies and chatting despite the storm. The sight tugged at something deep inside him. This was Margot's world, a place of warmth and purpose, so far removed from his own. He hesitated, debating whether he should go in. The thought of seeing her again, of facing the judgment in her eyes, filled him with dread. But the memory of her laughter, her determination, and the sacrifices she had made for him pushed him forward. He couldn't let fear hold him back any longer. When he stepped inside, the shelter was bustling. The scent of freshly cooked food lingered in the air, and the sound of children laughing echoed down the hallway. Jonathan scanned the room, his heart racing as he spotted Margot. She stood at a table, sorting through donations with a group of volunteers, her auburn hair pulled into a loose braid. She looked tired but radiant, her presence commanding attention without effort. Jonathan approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the hum of activity. One of the volunteers noticed him first, a young woman with a clipboard who raised an eyebrow at his tailored suit and polished shoes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. "I'm here to see Margot Hale," he said, keeping his voice steady. The woman frowned, glancing at Margot before calling out, "Hey, Margot! Someone's here to see you." Margot looked up, and when her eyes met Jonathan's, the world seemed to tilt. Her expression shifted from surprise to something unreadable, wariness, perhaps, or frustration. She straightened, brushing her hands on her jeans as she walked over. "Jonathan," she said, her voice measured. "What are you doing here?" He cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of how to begin. "I heard about the shelter," he said, keeping his tone businesslike. "I wanted to offer some advice. Strategic guidance, if you'll allow it." Margot folded her arms, studying him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Advice? From you? I know how to deal with people like the ones coming after you," he said, trying to mask the emotion in his voice. "Developers, lawyers, they're playing a game I'm very familiar with." Her eyes narrowed. "Why would you want to help me, Jonathan? Last I checked, this wasn't your world." He flinched but held her gaze. "Maybe it should have been," he said quietly. "Look, I know you don't trust me, and you have every reason not to. But you're up against people who won't stop until they get what they want. Let me help you fight them." Margot's posture softened slightly, but her skepticism remained. "And what's in it for you?" "Nothing," he said, the words surprising even him. "This isn't about me. It's about saving what you've built. What these people depend on." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. But if you're going to help, you do it on my terms. No backroom deals. No strings attached." "Agreed," he said, relief washing over him. Margot nodded toward an office in the back. "Let's talk." Jonathan followed her, his heart pounding as he realized how much was at stake, not just the shelter, but the fragile opportunity to earn back a sliver of the trust he had lost. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Jonathan sat across from Margot in the small, cluttered office at the back of the shelter. The room was utilitarian, with mismatched furniture and stacks of paperwork scattered on every available surface. A faint hum from a space heater filled the silence as Margot leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression guarded. "You've made your pitch," she said, her voice cool. "Now why don't you tell me what you're really doing here?" Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. I already told you, you want to help. Margot cut in, her tone sharp. Out of the goodness of your heart, right? Forgive me if that's a little hard to believe. Her words stung, but Jonathan couldn't blame her. The weight of their shared history hung between them like a shadow, every unspoken word an unresolved wound filling the space. He took a breath, steadying himself. I'm not here to make excuses or to pretend I haven't made mistakes, he said, his voice softer now. I saw the article about you. The shelter. It brought a lot of things back. Margot's gaze didn't waver, though something flickered in her eyes, something that looked like pain. What things? Jonathan hesitated. The words he had rehearsed in his mind felt inadequate now. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he spoke. You were always the best part of my life, Margot. And I didn't realize it until I lost you. Seeing that article, seeing what you've done, what you've built, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I've spent all these years telling myself I made the right choices, that the sacrifices were worth it. But the truth is, I was blind. I couldn't see what I had, what I gave up. Margot's jaw tightened, and she looked away, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of her chair. You're really good at saying the right thing when you want to, Jonathan. You always were. It's not just words, he said quickly, his voice pleading now. I'm trying to tell you that I see it, Margot. I see what I did to us. To you. Her head snapped back toward him, her eyes blazing. What you did? Jonathan, this isn't some mistake you can smooth over with an apology. You didn't just hurt me, you erased me. You made me feel like I was nothing. Like I didn't matter. The force of her words hit him like a physical blow. You mattered. God, Margot, you always mattered. Then why did you choose everything else over me? She demanded, her voice rising. I begged you to take a step back, to make room for us, and you couldn't even see past your own ambition. You wanted control, success, power, everything but a life with me. Jonathan's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down, he knew she wasn't. The truth was ugly and undeniable. I was selfish, he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was doing it for us, for the future. But I was wrong. I lost sight of what was important. Margot laughed bitterly, shaking her head. It's easy to say that now, isn't it? After you've built your empire, after you've gotten everything you wanted. It doesn't mean anything without you, he said, his voice cracking. None of it does. The house, the company, the money, it's all empty. I've spent years telling myself I was fine, that I'd moved on, but I haven't. Seeing you again. It's made me realize how much I've been lying to myself. Margot's expression softened for a moment, her lips pressing together, as if to hold back words she wasn't ready to say. But then her defenses went back up, her eyes narrowing. Do you even know what I've been through since we divorced? She asked, her voice trembling. Do you know how hard it was to pick up the pieces after you walked away? To rebuild my life without you? Jonathan shook his head, guilt twisting in his chest. I can't imagine. But I want to understand. I want to make it right. Margot laughed again, but this time it was softer, more pained. You can't just walk in here and fix everything, Jonathan. That's not how this works. I'm not trying to fix it, he said, leaning forward. I'm trying to be here for you. For once in my life, I want to do the right thing. Please, just let me help. Margot's eyes filled with tears, though she didn't let them fall. She looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his face. Finally, she spoke, her voice raw and vulnerable. Do you know why I stayed as long as I did? She asked. Why I fought so hard for us, even when it felt like I was losing you. Jonathan shook his head, his heart aching with the weight of her words. Because I loved you, she said, her voice breaking. And I thought if I just held on a little longer, you'd come back to me. That you'd remember the man you used to be. But you didn't. You just kept slipping further away, and I couldn't keep chasing you. Her words cut deeper than anything she had said before, and for a moment, All he could do was sit there, stunned. Finally, he found his voice. "I'm sorry, Margot," he said, the words thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything I put you through. I can't change the past, but I can try to be better now. I want to be better for you, for this shelter, for whatever chance we might still have." Margot's tears finally spilled over, and she wiped them away quickly, as if embarrassed. "You can't just say that and expect me to believe you, Jonathan. It's not that simple." "I know it's not," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove it to you. Just tell me what you need, and I'll do it." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Finally, Margot spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I never stopped loving you," she admitted, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But I can't go back to the way things were. I won't. If you want to be a part of my life, you need to prove that you've changed, that there's room for me this time." Jonathan nodded, his chest tight with both hope and fear. "I will," he said quietly. "I'll prove it to you, Margot. Whatever it takes." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded, her expression softening. "We'll see." It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. And for Jonathan, that was enough. For now. Jonathan left the shelter that night with Margot's words echoing in his mind. "We'll see." It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a second chance, not yet. But it was a crack in the wall between them, and for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. As he drove back to his penthouse, the magnitude of what lay ahead began to sink in. Margot wasn't asking for empty promises or grand gestures. She wanted proof, tangible, undeniable proof, that he had changed. And Jonathan knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to show her he was willing to sacrifice, the way she had once sacrificed for him. The following morning, Jonathan stood at the window of his office, looking out over the city. The skyline, a monument to his success, seemed less impressive now. It had taken years to build his empire, but for the first time, he questioned whether it had been worth it. All the wealth and power in the world couldn't erase the emptiness that had consumed him since Margot left. And now, he had a chance, just a chance, to set things right. He called Claire into his office. "I need you to set up a meeting with the board," he said, his voice calm but firm. Claire blinked in surprise. "The board? Is something wrong?" Jonathan hesitated, then shook his head. "No. But there's going to be a change. It's time." She didn't press further, though he could see the curiosity in her eyes. "I'll arrange it." Over the next few hours, Jonathan made the preparations in secret. He reviewed his finances, liquidated a portion of his assets, and ensured that every legal document was in place. He worked with precision, each step calculated to ensure that Margot's shelter would not only survive but thrive. When he was finished, he leaned back in his chair, exhausted but resolute. The board meeting took place in the glass-walled conference room at the top of Hale Innovations headquarters. The air was thick with anticipation as the members filed in, their murmurs of speculation growing louder when they saw the seriousness in Jonathan's expression. When everyone was seated, he stood at the head of the table and began to speak. "I've called this meeting to inform you of a decision I've made," he said, his voice steady. "Effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO of Hale Innovations." The room erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped as board members protested, demanded explanations, and tried to make sense of his announcement. Jonathan raised a hand, silencing them. "I know this is sudden," he said, "but it's something I've been considering for a while. Hale Innovations is in a strong position, and I believe the time has come for new leadership." One of the board members, an older man named Harris, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Jonathan, this company is your legacy. You built it from the ground up. Why would you walk away now?" Jonathan hesitated, searching for the right words. Finally, he said, "Because I've spent too long chasing the wrong kind of success. I thought building this company would give my life meaning, but I've realized that I've lost sight of what truly matters." The board exchanged confused and skeptical looks, but Jonathan pressed on. As part of this transition, I've also liquidated a portion of my assets to fund a project that's close to my heart. The funds will go toward the full renovation and long-term sustainability of a women's and children's shelter. It's a cause I believe in deeply, and it's where I intend to focus my energy moving forward. Harris looked at him as though he had grown a second head. Do you understand what you're saying? This move will destabilize the company. The markets will panic. I understand, Jonathan said calmly. And I trust you to manage it. Hale Innovations is strong enough to weather this. My decision isn't about the company, it's about doing what's right. After the meeting, Jonathan returned to his office, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the door. The shock on the board members' faces had been expected, but it didn't make the moment any easier. He leaned against his desk, exhaling slowly. He had taken the first step. Now came the hard part. That evening, he drove back to the shelter. The rain had stopped, and the streets were quiet, the city bathed in the warm glow of streetlights. Margot was inside, sorting through donations with the same quiet determination he had come to admire. When she saw him, she raised an eyebrow. Back so soon? She asked. I need to talk to you, he said. Margot sighed, setting down a box. This better not be another lecture on business strategy. It's not, Jonathan said, his voice soft. It's about what I've done. She frowned, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Jonathan hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed her a folder. Margot opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the documents inside. Her breath caught when she saw the financial statements, the legal agreements, and the details of the donation. Jonathan, this is... She trailed off, looking up at him with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. You did this? I did, he said. The shelter is safe. The mortgage is paid, the renovations are covered, and there's enough to keep it running for years. Margot shook her head, her voice trembling. This is too much. You didn't have to. Yes, I did, he interrupted. I owe you, Margot. For everything you gave up for me. For everything I took for granted. This is the least I can do. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. You sold part of your company for this. Do you even realize what you've done? You could lose everything. Jonathan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. You're what I worked for, Margot. I just didn't see it until now. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Margot looked away, her hands trembling as she clutched the folder. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Jonathan said gently. Just know that I mean it. Every word. I'm here for you, for this shelter, for whatever comes next. Margot looked back at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. For the first time, she saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man she had believed in before ambition consumed him. But the road to forgiveness was long, and she wasn't ready to let her guard down just yet. We'll see, she said softly, echoing the words she had spoken before. Jonathan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough. For now. Together, they stood in the quiet shelter, the future uncertain but filled with possibility. Jonathan returned to the shelter the next day, determined not to overwhelm Margot but to show her he was serious. She met him with cautious politeness, her walls still firmly in place, but something had shifted. The tension between them was no longer as sharp, replaced instead by a tentative truce. Over the following weeks, Jonathan kept his word. He didn't push, didn't try to take control. Instead, he worked quietly behind the scenes, using his connections and resources to support Margot's vision. Every move he made was deliberate, respectful. He didn't just want to help, he wanted to prove to her that he had learned from his mistakes. The shelter became a hive of activity as renovations began. Contractors arrived, volunteers doubled, and the children who frequented the shelter watched in awe as the tired old building transformed. The crumbling walls were repaired, new classrooms and play areas were added, and the kitchen was outfitted with state-of-the-art equipment. Margot's vision for a safe, welcoming space was finally coming to life. Jonathan spent his days coordinating donations, smoothing over legal hurdles, and keeping the developers at bay. But he never made himself the center of attention. This was Margot's world, and he knew better than to intrude. Margot, meanwhile, was tireless. She juggled the day-to-day operations of the shelter while leading the efforts to expand its programs. Every time Jonathan saw her interact with the women and children, his admiration for her grew. She wasn't just rebuilding a shelter, she was rebuilding lives. And in doing so, she was teaching him what it meant to truly make a difference. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margot found Jonathan repairing an old bookshelf in the shelter's library. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work. There was something different about him now, a humility she hadn't seen before. "You've been here almost every day," she said, breaking the silence. Jonathan looked up, surprised. "I wanted to make myself useful." "You have," she admitted. Her voice softened. "I didn't think you'd stick around this long." Jonathan set down the screwdriver and wiped his hands on a rag. "I told you, Margot. I'm not going anywhere." Margot hesitated, then stepped into the room. "I've been watching you. The way you've handled everything, the way you've stayed in the background. It's not the Jonathan I used to know." He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "Maybe that's a good thing." She leaned against the doorframe, studying him. "Maybe it is." For the first time, there was warmth in her voice, a flicker of the connection they had once shared. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Jonathan's chest tighten with hope. As the weeks turned into months, the shelter neared completion. Word spread about the project, and the community rallied behind it. Donations poured in, volunteers from all walks of life joined the cause, and Margot became a local hero. Jonathan watched with pride as she stepped into the spotlight, her passion and dedication shining brighter than ever. On the day of the grand reopening, the shelter was unrecognizable. The building gleamed, its fresh paint and new signage a testament to the hard work of everyone involved. The courtyard was filled with children playing, their laughter mingling with the hum of conversation as guests arrived for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Jonathan stayed in the background, letting Margot take center stage. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her auburn hair shining in the sunlight as she greeted the crowd. Her speech was heartfelt, filled with gratitude for the community's support and hope for the future of the shelter. When the time came to cut the ribbon, Margot turned to the crowd, scissors in hand. She hesitated for a moment, then scanned the faces until her eyes found Jonathan. A small, almost imperceptible smile crossed her lips. "Jonathan," she called, her voice clear. "Would you join me?" A murmur ran through the crowd as he stepped forward, his heart pounding. Margot handed him one side of the ribbon, her fingers brushing his. For a moment, their eyes met, and the world seemed to fade away. Together, they cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted into applause. After the ceremony, Jonathan lingered at the edge of the courtyard, watching as Margot moved through the crowd, greeting volunteers and guests. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to find her standing beside him. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked, his voice equally quiet. "For everything," she said. "For believing in this place. For believing in me." "I always believed in you," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just didn't show it the way I should have." Margot looked down, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You're different now, Jonathan. I can see it." "I'm trying," he said simply. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in years, there was no anger, no pain, only warmth. She reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. "Welcome home," she whispered. Jonathan's throat tightened, and he squeezed her hand gently. In that moment, surrounded by the laughter of children and the buzz of a community coming together, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Margot turned back to the crowd, her hand still in his, and together they stood at the heart of the shelter, a testament to second chances, redemption, and the power of love to rebuild what was once broken. Jonathan's journey is a powerful reminder that redemption is always possible, no matter how far we've strayed. By stepping away from the world of ambition and self-interest, he discovered something far more meaningful: the chance to make a genuine impact and rekindle the love he thought he had lost forever. Through courage, humility, and a willingness to take risks, Jonathan proved that it's never too late to rebuild, not just a shelter, but a life, a relationship, and a legacy that truly matters. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments. What would you do for a second chance? Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more inspiring stories, and share this video with someone who might need a little hope today. And remember, it's never too late to rewrite your own story. See you in the next video.